Well, we've been going through Jesus explaining what is the righteousness that surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees, and he touched on all kinds of things. Now, it's good for us to stop right here and explain this. Jesus is making enemies during the course of this message. Does everybody understand that? And you can't read it without starting to be suspicious that he's purposely making enemies. That doesn't sound like the Christian thing to do. But sometimes things, or in his case, the religious system has become so corrupt that you have to simply stand in the face of the corruption so that it will stop. And that will make enemies for you. And so when Jesus keeps saying, well, you've heard, think about it. If this would be like if there was a group of people in this church that were highly respected, and Jesus got up and preached a sermon where he spent an entire sermon on how you need to be more righteous than like the people in this group right here. I'm just picking on you guys today. But let's just say this is a group over here in the church. And Jesus is preaching an entire sermon about how, I'm just picking on you guys because I know you guys can take it, how they're not getting into heaven. Do you know how radical this is? And that he wants the rest of you to have a righteousness way more than theirs. Now, you guys, that's messing with you, putting people on the spot. But do you understand how radical this is, what he's doing to people? He's making enemies. He's going to die most likely because of this sermon and some other things as well. And he keeps naming them as well. He'll talk about the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, do you understand how radical this is? That Jesus knows that he's got to do this. And that people are not going to like this. Now, he has been going through basically taking parts of the Ten Commandments, explaining to you how this one group in the church are breaking these commandments, and we all thought that they were the high rollers in the church, and they really weren't. And he explains piece by piece. Well, they weren't keeping the commandment not to kill. They weren't keeping the commandment not to lust. They weren't keeping all these, and now he's going to basically call them, and they're also liars. This is incredible what he's doing. This guy is making enemies through this whole thing. So whenever we go through this, please don't let the power of it kind of settle off of you. The weight of this needs to really hammer you hard. And now he's going to go on and on and on, and he's not going to let up on these guys. But it's right that he doesn't let up on them, because he's got to make the point. Because people got to be able to make it into heaven. They need to understand the truth. And Jesus isn't bringing anything radical in terms of interpretation of the Ten Commandments. Jesus is simply saying they've all been interpreting it wrong in order to grant power to themselves over the rest of you. And now I'm going to give you the right interpretations. He's not introducing anything brand new to these commandments. He's bringing it back to what it was supposed to be. Well, anyway, it says, again, you have heard that the ancients were told, and he talks about you've heard it. Now, where have they heard this through? They've been hearing this through the scribes and the Pharisees, the people he's attacking. And he's saying, you've been hearing their preaching. He now literally, all through this, is attacking not just their righteousness, he's also attacking the way they teach the people. And he's telling them, if you're listening to these guys, you're going to get it wrong. You need to listen to me. And he says, you have heard, basically from the scribes and the Pharisees, that you are to not make false vows, and you are to keep your vows to God. All right. Well, it takes together a lot of passages about truthfulness from the Old Testament, but this mainly is rooted in the, 7th, 8th, you shall not deceive, you shall not lie. But even more than that, it really goes into the third commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Now, what they would do back then is they would make these vows. And the idea is, and maybe this isn't the way we go about it these days, but the idea is that if you attached the name of your deity to some kind of oath or vow, it was supposed to give that much more integrity to the claim that you're making, or the oath that you're making, or if you're doing a business deal or a contract or something like that. The closer you make a vow or an oath to things related to God, the greater the integrity of the statement that you're making. This is how they went about it. And so they've gotten the habit of making vows about things to confirm their truthfulness. But because they're good Jews, they don't want to break the third commandment, that you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And the reason is because he will not leave him guiltless, whoever does so. And so the idea is, if you take a vow and you attach God's name to it, and you don't keep that vow, you will be cursed. And this is where that concept comes from. And so sometimes people will say, God is my witness. Something like this. This is kind of the modern version of this. And so, and the ancients rightly told you, if you touch God in any way to the statements of your words, you better make your words truthful. And that's a good thing. Yeah. Whenever God is connected to any subject, you need to make sure that you're dealing rightly with this situation. Now, this doesn't sound like it's connected to this type of passage, but it really is. I'll give this example. I think I mentioned this in the young couples the other day. Sometimes in Midwest City, when I drive around Midwest City, it seems like once every 2 weeks, a different car will cut me off on Air Depot. Anybody ever been in Midwest City? Know where Air Depot is? It's always on Air Depot and 15th. And it will be a different car about every 2 weeks, would cut me off and make me so mad. And I'd look up and I'd see the same church's bumper sticker on that car. And it would be a different car every time, but I'm just dying to call up that pastor and say, you need to have a program on how to drive at your church. The idea is that, in a way, once that, and I won't say what the church is, you would all know it. They put a lot of bumper stickers out on vehicles. But once you attach that to the car, what do you really got to do with the way that you drive? You got to watch the way that you drive. Krista, did you tell me one time that we had like some Crossway bumper stickers and stuff? That sounds like a good idea, but then through my experience, sometimes I'm not sure that's a great idea. Particularly, I don't want to give any of these out to like teenagers or college students, maybe. I don't, maybe you have to do a driving test for me before you can get one, like license or something like that. But the second you attach God to something that you're doing, right, you've got to hold it to a higher level. Okay? And that's the way the people of God really should be. And so they were attaching God. And so the rabbis got in the habit, because some people would break these vows to God, and they were viewed as though they did have a curse, and that someday God is going to come around, and it says he will not hold him guiltless. He's basically going to punish this person for attaching his name to a lie. All right, that's real significant. And so what the Jewish people began to do is they would start to avoid that. They would do things like, well, I'm making a vow where I promise this by the altar of God. It's not God himself, so really now I'm just saying the altar. And so they try to attach it to things of value, and the only thing that gives value to things, as we heard in Mike's song, is that things have inherent value through their connection to God, right? And the master's hand touches the violin, and everyone suddenly is brought to their senses about the value because now it's been touched by the master's hand. And so they would kind of approach God in their vows and their promises, but it wouldn't go all the way. And so there became a thing amongst the scribes and the Pharisees where they would argue amongst themselves about what vows, what oaths had greater integrity. And they started to write entire volumes on, how severe certain statements should be taken as true. And this became a whole system of how they would go about truth among the Jews, developed by the rabbis and the scribes and the Pharisees. Can you see the problem with this? That'd be like, let's say two of you have come to some kind of agreement in this church. And maybe things aren't being held up on everybody's end. And so you decide one afternoon you're going to drive up here and you're going to track down the preacher and he's going to settle this for you. And you come in there and I start asking you, well, what exactly were your agreements based upon and all this stuff? And then I start to look at it and I go, well, did you agree to this based upon you promised in the name of the Lord or promised in the name of the church or anything? And so I would determine how much integrity your contract has. And so if the two of you only based a promise based upon maybe the parking lot, you might not have to keep that. It doesn't require as much integrity. You see the craziness of this. Now, I'm going to back off of this a little bit, and I want to explain something that's going on in philosophy here in the United States right now, and a little bit in Europe. There's a thing what we call postmodernism. It's just a word. It's just a fancy word. Postmodernism, and also there's an approach to language that they call deconstruction. And this really exploded big in the 90s, and it still holds with a lot of professors in the universities. And the idea is that language doesn't actually convey any truth. Not any real truth. And so whenever you say book, that all that's really going on here is that there's nothing between the word book and this, really. It's that we have chosen as a society to play a game that we call the English language. And so it has certain rules, and we all have come to an agreement that there will be meaning to certain sounds that come out of our mouth and stuff like that. But ultimately, there's no real connection between truth and your words. And so the only reason that we can understand each other is that we're all kind of playing a big Monopoly game with our language that we have come to agree on. So when you play Monopoly, don't we all agree to go by the rules of the game of Monopoly? And so we play a language game with each other. And every little society has kind of their language bubble. And the people in that society play a game within their language. And that they're not talking about truth at all. It's just things they happen to agree on. All right? This is totally damaging. And you don't know how much this has invaded into society. And this is taught in all kinds of universities. I don't know if it's taught here. I'm sure OSU is perfect. But this is very pervading. And the idea of this, and this was a movie that came out in the 90s, the movie The Matrix. I don't know if anyone ever saw that. All sci-fi and all this stuff. But the idea is that we really live in a world where the rules have been made up. And that we're just following the rules. And that if you really want to achieve something great and astounding, you've got to learn how to bend the rules and learn how to exceed the rules and understand that all they are is just something that is made up and created by people in a false reality that you're dealing with. And that if you can get beyond the rules and the regulations and all that, anything is possible for you. Okay? There was a lot more to that movie than that. It's very, very philosophical. But this is the way a lot of youth think. And I used to teach youth all the time. And really, words to them got to the point where it almost had no meaning. And it was amazing how it was so hard to get across the subject of truth to these little kids. Because truth had been smashed so much in their eyes. Now, let's go forward with this and see where this goes. And then Jesus says to him, and you, let's see, where is it? Verse 33. Okay, the filling of the vows. But I say to you, make no oath at all. Jesus says, make no oath at all, neither by heaven, because that is the throne of God, nor by earth, because that is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, because that is the city of the great king. Now all that, the city of the great king comes out of Psalms 48. But the first two, about Jerusalem, about the throne of God being heaven, and about earth being the footstool, comes out of Isaiah 66, the last chapter of Isaiah, where God stands up and he says, thus says the Lord, the throne, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. And he says, where will you find a house to be able to build for me? Where will you be able to give me rest? I have made it all. And all these things have come into being because of me, thus says the Lord. And so he interprets all of this in light of Isaiah 66, where Isaiah 66 says, you can't find anything in this world by which you can have value attached to your promises that aren't ultimately given to you by God. So indirectly, anytime you lie in any way or shape or form, or you break a contract, or you go against your promises with anybody, you have blasphemed God and you have broken the third commandment. And that is pretty staggering. That the name of God actually is being slandered by you, particularly as a Christian, anytime that you lie or you do not keep your vows together. So Jesus is basically saying this. Now, some people have said, well, does this mean that we can't take any vow or any oath, like whenever a Christian goes into a courtroom? Some people have gone so far that they say, well, Jesus is saying something here, it's just emphatic. It says you shouldn't make any oaths at all. So whenever Christians go into a courtroom, you should not lay your hand on the Bible, and you shouldn't take any type of an oath at all, or you shouldn't be taking any contracts. Some people have really gone far, and I believe that Anabaptists historically really went far with this. No, that wouldn't be right, because we know that Paul took oaths and called God as his witness multiple times. One of them is in Galatians, I know. Jesus himself had to testify under oath before the Sanhedrin. So the idea is within the context where you yourself are volunteering oaths and vows to try to confirm statements to other people. Not in terms of dealing with government entities and just making contracts. Does that make sense to you? Because some people have said any oath at all is wrong. But that's not really what I'm saying within the context. So, what we have here is that your language that you say with people needs to be taken as sacred. Words are sacred. They are actually they're to be truth possessors. Okay? And so the same way you wouldn't want to blaspheme God with your words is the same way you take every single statement that you say to another individual, because you are attaching God's integrity to your own statements. Because particularly when you're a Christian, your statements are directly connected with God. And the reason he talks about, goes even as far as, and he says that you're not to make an oath even based upon your head, because you can't make one hair white or black, is because of this. Now obviously in the Middle East what you have is most people have dark hair or black hair or brown hair, something like that. And you don't really in the Middle East get white hair except for by what? Yeah, back then they probably weren't dyeing their hair or anything like that very much. You always have the skeptic who will come in here and say, sure, you can change the color of your hair. That's not the point. The idea is about age, that you have no control over your age, and that the changing of your hair color is totally out of your control. But even something like the hair on your head, I mean, if I was to pluck a hair on my head, you wouldn't think of that as something all that divine and holy, right? And so he goes from the point of talking about heaven. And some people would make oaths on heaven. Some people would make oaths on earth. Some people would make oaths on Jerusalem. And by the way, the city of the great king, that's not a reference to David. Over in Psalms 48, it's a reference to God and his Messiah. But whenever you take the hair of your head, Jesus purposely went to something that would seem insignificant. That'd be like saying even a piece of lint. You cannot make even a vow on a piece of lint without you having to take it with total integrity. What's integrity mean? All right, so anyone who deals with mechanics, you know that integrity, say like with iron. How does the integrity of iron get decayed? Through rust, right? The strength of it. It cannot bear up as much weight after a while. It can't bear up and it will snap if you put enough weight on iron that is losing its integrity. The idea is that there should be nothing, no circumstance that can come up in accord with any of your contracts or your commitments to other people, promises that you have made to them. There can be nothing that will break that your word is your bond, that your word is like iron, and it has integrity, not rusted iron. It's like iron that will not budge. And this, we think, well, you know what, this isn't a super big problem in the church. This may have been a problem back then, but that's not really the case. I remember I was in a church a little while back, I'll say about 8 years. And there was a guy who sold his truck to another church member. It's just, you can see this is going to go bad, right? Business amongst church members. There are some people who believe that's the best kind of business you can have because, I don't know, maybe you can take advantage of people. And then there's other people who start to realize, you know what, sometimes it can get sticky because sometimes church people aren't so church people after all. Well, anyway, the guy sold a truck to another guy for $400. Not a big deal, right? Anyone could handle $400. The other guy simply just paid him $100 and never did pay him back. He was going to pay it out, right? He was going to pay month by month. The guy never saw the money. Something just like that starts to erode and cause a major rift inside this church. $400 over a truck. All because a man could not keep his integrity in his statements to another brother in the Lord. And so eventually, It gets frustrating, and the one guy calls the pastor, and the pastor says, well, I kind of want to stay out of this stuff, and so, but, give it some time. Call him, talk to him, see if you can get this to go. And after a while, about 2 more months go by, the guy still hasn't paid any money at all. After a while, they call the pastor, and he says, you've got to talk to this guy. Well, finally, the one guy who had sold the truck did the right thing. He just forgot about it. Because he knew that the cost that he was going to have to pay to get the rest of his money could be the cost of really damaging the church that he's in. And obviously, you got 2 families involved when you're talking about church, right? Not just one person. We're talking about people involved. Hey, some churches only got 2 families in the whole church. You could destroy the whole thing. All over a full-size Chevy. So what happens is he lets it go because he realized the other guy's integrity was so faulty that that man's integrity could destroy the church. And he just forgot about it. But you know what? It's interesting. The passage about not taking the name of the Lord in vain, which Jesus kind of connects right here to your truth. I don't know how it worked out, but about 2 years after this, the guy who never paid for that truck winds up his wife kicking him out of the house, having to go live in a little hotel, and he paid a high price. Now, no one really knows what happened with the wife and him, but it probably has something to do with his integrity, don't you think? Because the integrity that happened with this guy wasn't just a problem with doing a deal over a pickup truck. It expanded. And somehow, for some reason, suddenly, on one Tuesday afternoon, his wife wanted him out the door. Integrity is a big deal. So, the idea that even the hair of your head has value in terms of whether or not you tell the truth. And I want you to understand this. Jesus did a little something here that's interesting, that a lot of people don't seem to catch. Everything in this planet, if you can rest your truth upon it, because I'd say the ultimate truth would be God. What the Latin is to say, summa verum. The chief truth is God. And so, if the chief truth is God, invades into everything inside of your life, everything that you could ever speak about, any kind of subject that you could ever talk about to anybody, then there must be a realization, even when you're talking about the smallest thing with people, that integrity must be in your words. And that you cannot deal falsely with people. And people tend to think that this is a small thing. In our society, we think that this is a small thing. But our society has the most insane legal system. Do you know what brought down Rome? They had an overworked legal system and nobody wanted to work. It got to the point in Rome that they did this. They made a law that said that the farmers had to stay on their land. And what do you think they had to do that? Because the farmers were getting so lazy they wouldn't even work on the land. Rome was falling apart. And their legal system was falling apart, all because the concept of truth had fallen apart in Rome. And the concept of truth has fallen apart in the United States. But in a time where we are in moral decline in this nation, don't think it's a small thing for you, just a simple little country person from Stillwater, to be truthful. You have, particularly, you come to the doors of this church, we portray ourselves as Christians, the integrity of your words got to hold up in your business dealings, with your family, with other church members, obviously, with everyone, even with your little children. The integrity of who you are has got to be solid because you're representing God. And if you would treat every word that comes out your mouth as though it's a matter of the blasphemy or not of God, you'd be much more truthful. Let's all stand together, Lord, in prayer.